The house breathes like something exhausted after a long argument. Rain has stitched the world into grey, and the tall windows of the master suite gather the night into a single dull mirror. In the bed, two small forms lie curled against one another, chest rising in the steady rhythm of sleep for the first time in months. A soft hum, half lullaby, half whisper, hovers in the air. Maya Williams stands at the doorway, coat clutched against her ribs, watching them. She counts the spaces between their breaths the way some people count the cracks in an old wall, not to judge, but to learn where it needs mending. Ethan's hand is tucked under his chin. Eli's hair is mussed like the top of a pencil sketch. They are a study in small mercies, a scavenged stuffed giraffe between them, a sketchbook face down on the bedside table. If anyone could see the city reflected in those sleeping faces, they'd reconstruct the house across 1,000 tiny details. Refrigerator magnets in a crooked line, a coffee-stained binder labeled schedules, a gilded frame with one empty spot on the wall. If anyone could understand the months of sleeplessness, the clench of fear at every raised voice, the way each tantrum sounded like a place about to burn, it would be possible to name what had been at stake tonight. The fragile, hard-won peace of two children who had begun under Maya's watch to believe in night again. The door opens. Edward Hawthorne fills the doorway first with the weight of his coat, rain sluiced through the fabric and the decision in his shoulders. He has been away. Late meetings, a hospital wing where Rebecca's name lives in a ledger of bleeding, and then silence. He has been away from what grief does to the small things, and now he is home, eyes raw, hair plastered to his temple, hands that have handled contracts and construction and crisis now trembling over a brass knob. He pauses at the sight of Maya. For a second, the world cinches into a single pulse, a woman in a pale cardigan, dark hair pinned back, hands empty and steady. The air does not wait for explanation. His tongue finds a small, jagged thing that passes for logic when shame is raw. Someone else in the bed with his sons, someone who doesn't share his blood, someone who has not been authorized. The strike is a clean, bright thing. It collides with Maya's cheek and with the air, a sound that should have no place in a house built on money and careful schedules. It is not the sound of a lover's quarrel, nor of a parent correcting a child. It is the thin crack of unwillingness to be told no. Quiet snaps into an audible absence. Somewhere down the hall, a wind chime trembles. The twins do not wake. Night has taught them to swallow their alarms so their world won't fall apart. Maya touches her face, not for pain, but to measure the rupture. The room spins, not with the force of the blow, but with the familiarity of being in the middle of other people's storms. Her voice, when it comes, is not loud. It is a ledger entry of limits. "You have to leave," she says. For a moment, Edward is thunderstruck, part of him expecting a struggle, another part imagining that anger might salvage something that grief stole. He starts to speak, to say Rebecca's name, to explain the bed and the state of the boys, to offer 1,000 justifications that sound small and thin in the cold. Maya watches his mouth move, like someone watching a clock whose hands do not tell the right time. She gathers her coat from a chair. She wraps enough warmth around the boys to smooth their sheets, checks the nightlight, breathes in their sleeping smell, a mix of lemon shampoo and the faint dust of crayons. She leaves without a suitcase, the way someone leaves a house, not because there is nothing to take, but because what matters is already there. She slips a small folded scrap of paper across the mantel. The pen had been in her pocket, ink wobbly as her pulse. It is not a sermon. It is not an ultimatum. It is a boundary. Edward watches the back of her head until the door shuts and the sound of rain takes her. Afterward, the house is a list of things that happened precisely because it is built to keep things in. He unbuttons his coat slowly, as if undoing the blow, and for the first time the hollow where Rebecca's photograph used to sit does not hold up. If you believe someone's presence can change a life, tap-like. When the door clicks behind her, Maya walks into a rain that smells like wet asphalt, a new beginnings gone small. She doesn't look back. Her chest is a careful business. There are no dramatic turns, no running through the streets. Just a woman taking the city in measured steps the way she teaches a child to cross the street. Look, breathe, choose. The train station is square and warm, a different kind of shelter. The platform hums with the low symphony of overnight travel. Maya sits on a bench, the one with a missing slat where teenagers have left their names carved in the wood, and opens her bag. There is salt on her coat where rain has pooled. There are slight crescent moons under her eyes where sleep has not been earned easily. Her life never contained many luxuries, but it has work that sticks. She spends the late hours teaching, not because she needs a job, but because she needs the reciprocity. The shelter above the community center has mattresses lined like quiet islands. Tonight, she leads a group through a scribbled map of the day. How to set a routine when the day can be a storm. How to use a sketchbook as a safe place for thoughts that have nowhere to go. The children follow, skeptical and tender. When she hums the soft lullaby under her breath, 17-year-old Maria leans closer, one shoulder against the wall. And for a slow beat, the room remembers how to breathe as one. Maya does not speak about her past easily. Fragments appear in the way she folds her hands, in the presence of someone who has learned to wait. She mentions a foster home in a sentence that sounds like weather, brief, not descriptive. She doesn't tell them about the time someone else left without apologizing. She demonstrates instead. She holds a small boy's hand until he falls asleep on her lap. She teaches a teen how to stitch a torn hem. She stitches the edges of lives with the quiet of practical care. Edward sits at his study, the rain dragging grey across the glass. He reads the scrap of paper folded like a plea that someone else made for the boy's future. He reads it again and again, each time a new sentence underlining a fault line he had refused to see. It doesn't tell him what to do. It points out the shape of what was lost in his grip, the voice he used when he thought he could schedule other people's love. The note is not accusatory, it is a mirror. Words on a small paper arrange themselves into a lesson he had been avoiding. Staying is not a stunt, it is a practice. He holds the remembrance in his hand and feels, for the first time since the funeral, less like a patriarch and more like a man who has been permitted to start again. He finds Maya 2 days later. The shelter has rules about privacy. Volunteers make calls in the office and check IDs. Edward sits in an uncomfortable plastic chair and waits for someone with the capacity to say the right thing. He rehearses apologies like they are contracts. He practices small words until they are thin. When she walks into the room, she carries the same compact steadiness. Her shoulders don't look surprised to find him there. Maybe she had known he would come. Or maybe she had expected that anyone who built a house with so many locks would also carry something that could be unlocked. Their first conversation is not a reconciliation. It is an audit. He says her name, and it sounds clumsy in his mouth. He stumbles through the parts that require honesty. The funeral, the nights, his fear, his bad hand. He apologizes, and there is no performance to it, no contrived nobility, just the brittle thing of a man admitting that the way he loved had been a kind of containment rather than shelter. Maya listens. She is not the kind of person who forgives for the ease of peace. She has watched the fallout of cheap absolution. Instead, she lists conditions, simple, exacting, and humane. No cameras in the children's rooms, no outside statements about what happens in the private life of the boys, family meals that are interruptions to business, not ornaments, and a shared set of rules that everyone in the house is expected to live by. She asks for accountability that is practical, weekly check-ins, a counselor on retainer, consistent bedtime rituals. She demands that the boys' agency be honored. They will choose one small thing a week, a breakfast, a game, a book. Edward hears the terms and recognizes them as things a man with power should have offered him earlier. He offers what he can: funding, space, the means to create stability. But he learns slowly, in the room with fluorescent lights humming above them, that money cannot be handed in place of presence. Maya does not want the check, she wants the man to remain. Their agreement is not a romantic reunion. It is a contract of presence. She will come back. He will do the uncomfortable work. He signs with a hand that is steadier than his heart feels. When they return to the house, there are small witnesses. The butler, Mr. Keller, who has known the family for decades and keeps his eyes kind and a little wary. Harold, who handles the downstairs like it is a confession he has to clean. A gardener who brings in a bag of salt for the sidewalk, as if the property could be purified by ordinary acts. The twins watch from the doorway, holding two small bruise-color stuffed animals like flags. Ethan will not meet Edward's eyes at first. Eli clutches a sun-worn drawing. Maya opens the refrigerator and pulls out a stack of magnets, letters, and a sunflower, a small painted rock with the word "Hold." She begins to rearrange them, not with symbolism, but with the quiet logic of structure. She writes on a peel-off notepad and steels herself to be the one to set the new rhythms. The rules are practical, small, and insistently tender. Eating at the table if we can. Screens off 30 minutes before bed. No raised voices in the bedroom wing. Ask before you open someone's room. The rules are hung with blue painter's tape on the fridge. Crooked human. The boys argue over what to put first. Edward sits at the counter and learns to listen. For an older man whose life has been schedules and bottom lines, listening feels like stepping into a room without shoes. Uncomfortable, but necessary. Maya introduces rituals, a cup of chamomile at sundown, a sketch time where the twins draw how their day felt, a nightly question, 2 things you liked, 1 thing you want to change. She refuses to sanitize grief. She gives it names. She allows the house to have sorrow as a neighbor that can visit without living there. Slowly, with all the friction of hearts learning new muscle memory, small victories happen. Ethan tells a small joke at breakfast and the laugh cracks open the morning. Eli gives Edward a picture, sun with 2 stick figures, and Edward frames it in his study. It is not redemption, it is a wet lettuce of small recoveries, a series of actions that repeated build a kind of new architecture. Maya is careful to teach the boys how to talk about boundaries. She teaches them, too, that being safe is not the same as being free of disappointment. Perhaps the most important lesson is her own. Staying does not require diminishing yourself. She makes a room in the house to hold both her work and their needs. She begins to sleep on an armchair at night, not because she doesn't deserve a bed, but because she wants the boys to know that someone will remain awake if the thunder returns. In the mornings, she takes the twins to the local community garden, where an old oak tree stands like a sentinel. They plant a sunflower seed together, small, a gesture more than a plan, and each of the boys presses their thumb into the earth like a comma that might one day become a sentence. The oak does not promise shade tomorrow, it only promises that it has endured. Maya talks to the boys about endurance, about how plants can break open in small ways and yet still be whole. Edward sits on a bench and watches them. His hands know the weight of ledgers and the slightest tremor when a decision goes wrong. He also knows now the precise shape of nights spent arguing with absence. He begins then, clumsily, to practice presence, showing up for school plays without calling the office first, staying when a tantrum builds as if his being there is itself the scaffolding that holds a child in place. Outside the house at first, nothing seems to shift. Wealth smells the same in the rain, but inside there is a small rearrangement of priorities. Toys sorted into baskets, labelled with names. A file drawer where receipts are kept alongside permission slips. A counselor's number affixed to a magnet like a talisman. The world outside may still measure things in skyline and stock, but the world inside counts in spoons of honey given with tea and the number of times a child's hem is sewn straight. And yet the universe that loves cause and effect also loves opposition. The family house is visible down the block, the gilded gate, the winter box of ivy. It is the kind of home that by its very neatness invites opinions. It invites the world to make judgments about the way power should be used. It invites relatives. No one mentions it at first, the iron in the throat of the house because of those who remember. 2 weeks after Maya's return, an envelope arrives addressed to Edward. It carries on its face the sort of authority that does not ask permission to be invasive. A notice. The handwriting, formal and thin, has the smell of precedent. When Edward opens it, the paper inside is the colour of law and memory. It says that James and Eleanor Hollingsworth, Rebecca's parents, intend to petition the court for guardianship. They cite concerns and stability. They claim proximity to a child as an argument for custody. The words are careful weapons. Maya finds Edward in the study when he reads the letter. He is old-fashioned in the way that people of money sometimes are. He believes that writing can be made to do what one wants, that signatures solve things. But in his chest, under the business acumen, there is a man who is finally learning humility. Now he looks hollow at not being able to guarantee everything with an asset. They do not react with theatrics. The room takes in the news, like someone noticing a weather change. Adapt, prepare, and be honest. There is a legal process in motion. Courts, timelines, witness lists, the small mechanics of a system that decides whose home is more fit. Reason. It is a formality dressed as a crisis, but for the boys, it might mean the very thing Maya had tried to protect when she walked into the rain. The loss of a home not simply of bricks, but of the ritualized care that had begun to hold them. Maya's face is a small map of decisions, to fight or to prepare. She chooses both. Fight with procedural precision. She will call witnesses, collect logs of bedtime rituals, assemble a record of school attendance, the counselor's notes, the twins' art that shows progression from jagged storms to pictures with skies. Evidence of presence rather than presence as a slogan. Her mind is not a stranger to paperwork. Her years in the shelter have taught her how to turn lived experience into documents that a court understands. A practice of translation into legal language without losing the truth. Edward will not be able to buy his way out of this, and in that unlikely humility he finds the place where transformation can actually begin. He starts to attend the counseling sessions he had once outsourced to anonymous professionals. He sits quietly, while Belle, a teenager in a hoodie who works the snack table after school, tells a small, sharp story about trust. He learns to answer questions without strategizing, and to let silence be an honest thing rather than a space to fill. Their first strategy session for the impending petition is a study in coalition building. Lionel Pierce, a friend of Edward's who knows the language of public perception, suggests preemptive statements, op-eds, a curated narrative. Joseph Kim, the family lawyer, talks timelines and petitions, the kinds of things that make a judge nod. Dr. Angela Monroe, a therapist from the shelter now consulting pro bono, recommends records that show the boys' gradual emotional regulation. The team forms like a small government: money, law, lived practice, and the voice of the community. Maya insists on something else: witnesses. Not the powerful lists of people with titles, but pragmatic testimony from the people who have been with the boys when they were at their worst, and watched them get better in small, specific ways. Mr. Keller will testify about routines in the house. Harold will talk about how the twins' sleeping patterns have stabilized. The twins' teacher, tender and careful, will speak to the kids' behavior in class. Belle, who has been quiet and wary in public, will present an art piece that communicates a line from fear to trust. It is not triangulation with money. It is evidence of relational continuity. There is an evening when Edward sits on the stoop and watches Maya teach a group of children across the street. He drinks tea that is too bitter for comfort and thinks of Rebecca. Grief is a reef with currents that can wreck even the best-intentioned swim. He is learning to take instructions from grief rather than to command it. He makes a small note to himself, an idea that feels like both contrition and possibility. If the boys need continuity, perhaps that same continuity could be extended to others who carry the weight of unstable childhoods. It is not a philanthropic thought, it is a relational one. He draws the skeleton of a plan, a place not to rescue but to nurture, built around people with lived experience. Maya, who overhears a fragment of the idea, does not smile at the word foundation the way other people might. She remembers how organizations can be places where money talks more than people, where survivors are asked to be decorative proof instead of respected leaders. She refuses, at least initially, to let Edward's idea become another polished thing on a shelf. Instead, she insists on a different approach. Build something that centers mentorship, that pays people with lived experience, that allows those who have been through the system to make the rules that affect youth. She insists on transparency, on avoiding the hollow rhetoric that accompanies certain kinds of funding. Their conversation spins out like two plans trying to fit together. Edward wants to offer resources. Maya wants to offer a model. They are both right and both wrong in ways that matter. It is the kind of negotiation where ego must sit in the corner and watch the work happen. For the first time since the night she left, Maya sleeps in the bed. The armchair becomes a relic. It is not a sign that everything is healed. It is a sign that she believes enough in the small structures of safety to risk softer nights. The boys drift and are sometimes startled awake, but each time Maya's presence is a practiced good. A hand that finds a shoulder, a hum that translates into a small calm. On a grey morning, a courier arrives with an envelope stamped in a color that lives in courtrooms. Maya opens it in the kitchen, among the cups and magnets, and reads the words with a measured breath. The Hollingsworths have filed their petition. The paper is clinical, listing concerns about long-term stability, lapses in professional care, and a litany of things that sound as if they belong on a checklist rather than in the soft interior of a child's life. She closes the envelope without making a sound and looks at the refrigerator where the rules hang. The blue tape flutters a little in the drafty air. Ethan and Eli are at the table with a pile of crayons. Eli glances up, a small question in his face. There is no dramatic answer. Maya sets down the envelope like an unwanted plate and wipes her hands on the dish towel, an old human motion, and tells them they will have pasta for dinner that night, their favorite. When she sits for a beat, the house seems to hold its breath. Outside, at the edges, things are assembling. Rumor, procedure, an argument that will play out where the personal becomes public. Inside, the small engines of their life keep moving. Maya places a sketchbook in front of the twins and says gently, "Draw what makes you feel safe." They look at each other, at her, and pick colors. The smallest acts, color into space, rules on a fridge, become a ledger as much as any legal document. The trouble on paper is a thin thing in the early days. Signatures, notices, the rustle of counsel talking about motions and standard timelines. But the air has a tension to it, the way wire hums before an orchestra plays. It is perhaps the precise kind of pressure that reveals the real contours of patience and the real measure of staying. That night, Before the children sleep, after the crayons and after the songs, Edward kneels at the foot of the boy's bed and whispers a promise in a voice that has not yet learned to be gentle without rehearsal. Maya watches him from the doorway. He is not a perfect man. He makes mistakes that are startling in their persistence. But he is showing up in ways that are new. He lets his chest be a place that can begin to hold others, even if it is shaky at the seams. The little painted rock with the word hold, barely more than a pebble, sits now on the mantel. Maya reached it from the community garden yesterday. She cleaned it and painted it with gold at the edge, a private kinugi, a repaired crack that glints instead of hiding. It is not boastful, it is a reminder. Repair can be a visible celebration, not an apology. Outside, the night is drier. Somewhere a neighbor pulls shades, a dog barks twice and is silent. The house is readying itself for the thing on paper. A petition is not the same as a courtroom drama on television. It is quiet, methodical, and consequential. Evidence will be requested. Witnesses will be called. Lives will be passed in words meant to sound objective. Maya writes a list. Witnesses, school records, sleep logs, the counselor's notes, the sketchbooks that show days moving from scribbles to stories. She adds a line, unexpected, not legal, but true. Community testimonies. People who had seen the boys come out of a place where sleep was a stranger and into one where dreams return. Edward sits across from her. His palms are still large and capable of commanding a room. Today, they hold a pen. He draws a line under a budget item and looks up. "We can fund a pilot," he says, and he means it. Maya's eyes narrow, not in suspicion, but in assessment. "Fund it," she says, "if it centers survivors, if survivors lead, and if the money doesn't end up deciding who stays and who goes." He nods. He has the luxury to bargain from a place of means. She has the wisdom to turn that means into something that respects people's dignity. They begin to write the first page of an agreement, co-directorship that pays lived experience, a board that includes mentors from the shelter, a commitment to hiring people who have been through the systems the center will serve. It reads less like bank statements and more like a promise. And then a call comes that drops into the room like cold. An anonymous email, received by a local journalist, questioning Maya's background. Small half-truths shaped into suspicion. Someone has sent in a forged form about a past case. The author suggests, tastefully, that the house may be ill-prepared to care for children. The journalist is coy. "We'll run it unless you respond." The smear is a device flatly designed to manufacture doubt. Maya reads the email and does not allow panic to enter. She has seen how these things work. People who would otherwise offer to help now circle their wagons. The defense begins to feel like a second job. The line between public perception and private care starts to wrinkle. She feels, suddenly, the brittle quality of being visible. Edward's hand finds hers, not a theatrical grip, a steadying touch. He does not have to ask. He does not have to wonder what his role must be. He walks to the phone and makes a call to the lawyer, to his friend in the press, to the counselor. He organizes a meeting and tells her plainly, "We face them together." Maya nods, and for a moment her shoulders drop. She knows the terrain of suspicion of being questioned for what one has survived. She has run interventions that have dismantled myths before. She also knows something else. Truth, told plainly, is its own armor. So she begins to assemble the record like a hand that lays out stones for a wall, placement, integrity, and purpose. The sketchbooks are scanned, logs are transcribed. Belle is asked if she will speak, and Belle says nothing for a long time, and then, slowly, yes. They are not naive. They understand that funds and headlines can be fickle. They prepare statements, but the guiding principle is clear. The children's privacy will not be sold for optics. The press release will avoid names. The evidence will be clear and professional. The community will be invited to speak with consent. No child's pain will be retold for entertainment. The house adjusts to the drumbeat of pre-trial and pretext. More meetings, more phone calls, more small ironings of routine. Ethan begins to sleep better. Eli brings Maya a drawing of the house with a tiny person with a big hand reaching down. It is the sort of art that can make an adult cry quietly into a sleeve. The petition sits like a held breath, waiting to be exhaled into the processes of law. The smear sits like a grit in an ordered system that otherwise prefers gloss. And in the middle of it all stands a woman who, the night she left, chose to preserve a children's sleep rather than her own comfort. A man who is learning to be accountable. Two boys who are practicing what trust feels like in small doses. And a community readying to show up. The next morning, Maya pins the fridge rules again, smoothing the tape, writing a corner. It is a small domestic gesture before a public one, a mothering act of arranging the home to be a place of safety and predictability. The magnet with the painted word "Hold" sits new and bright on the top corner. Across the city, a legal filing is being prepared. The Hollingsworths are gathering affidavits. A reporter drafts a piece that will need to decide whether to dwell on scandal or on system. Back in the house, over toast and chamomile, two small boys draw suns with 5 rays each and argue about whose sun is bigger. No one here is blind to the fact that what happens next will be hard. But there is a quiet confidence that some fights should be fought with evidence, and the rest with the steady rhythm of ordinary care. Maya packs her bag for the day. She will teach at the shelter in the afternoon, meet with a counselor in the early evening, attend a community forum at night where people will talk about children and care. She takes the little pebble, the one painted with gold at the edge, and slips it into her pocket. It is a ritual and a talisman both. As she steps out, Edward pauses at the front door. He watches her walk away like a man aware that he has been given a second chance at something he did not know how to value before. He folds the day into papers and cares, and, in a small private moment, takes the twins to school. He sits in the car outside while they run to the gate because presence is a muscle he is learning to exercise even when no one applauds. The story of this house is, at root, a question about what it means to stay. Maya had left once when she felt pushed, and she has returned on her own terms. Now the structure of a family must withstand outside pressures that will test those terms. The next days will be filled with hearings and hearings of a different kind. Public hearings, investigatory hearings, the sort of examinations that demand both the poetry of lived care and the prose of documentation. A knock on the door interrupts the quiet. Mr. Keller stands, umbrella in hand, face like a page folded at the corner. The newspaper he holds is damp. He places it on the table without a flourish. The headline is measured. Local family faces guardianship petition. The subhead teases the anonymous accusations. Maya reads it once, twice. The words on the page are not the truth they live. They are a reflection, dim and imprecise. She folds the paper and places it in a small stack with the counselor's notes. She breathes in and out like someone steadying an anxious child. Then, with the purposeful patience of someone whose life has been a series of small returns, she begins to plan. Witness lists, counseling dates, a public statement limited in scope and generous in truth. She will not let the story of these boys be written by those who would misunderstand them. She will not let the house be defined by someone else's fear. Outside, the oak in the community garden rocks in a wind that is not violent yet. The seed they planted waits under the soil to see if it will rise. The painted rock in her pocket presses warm against her thigh, a small, gold-edged promise. The petition will arrive. The smear will try to wound. The court will invite strangers into the private architecture of a family. But in the kitchen, in the way the fridge magnets are arranged, in the way children learn to ask permission and to say what they need, a different kind of architecture has already been erected, one not built of contracts and ledgers, but of small, stubborn acts of staying. The petition would not be a single sharp strike. It entered their lives like a tide, a process that required responses, witnesses, filings, and the steady exhaustion that comes with having to prove an interior life in public. The house learned a new routine carved by lawyers' hours and school pickup times. Mr. Keller kept a quiet ledger of who sat where in waiting rooms. Harold fixed collars and fetched water for visiting witnesses. Edward's calendars, once a cathedral of meetings and deliveries, now held depositions and court dates. Every time the twins asked why people were talking about a court, Maya answered with the same small honesty she taught the children to give when a friend asked for help, because sometimes big people disagree about what safe looks like. She allowed the question to live as a true one rather than a heavy, definitive thing. The court date was months away, time compressed by petitions and counter-petitions, but measured in afternoons of testimony rather than the cinematic rhythms of a headline. Their strategy, hammered out over sheets of notes and counseling summaries, focused on continuity. They would not make a spectacle of the boys' suffering. They would show, quietly, the architecture of care, logs of nights the twins had slept in their beds without waking, a record of school attendance that mapped a gradual steadiness, testimony about the rituals that had become reliable, bedtime chamomile, sketch time, the nightly question, that signified pattern and intention rather than mere provision. Judge Templeton was the sort of jurist who looked less like a costume and more like a person who had practiced looking at other people's grief for a long time. He had the worn patience of someone who understood that family law was both granular and moral. Small things, how quickly a parent answered a text meant for a teacher, the presence of a long-term caregiver, could, in the judge's view, add up to an ethical contour as definitive as any statute. The courtroom, the day of the hearing, was quiet in a way that made the twins grip each other's hands. James and Eleanor Hollingsworth entered with a precision that discomforted the room. They were dressed for a ledger, perfectly pressed, measured gestures as if their composure could stand in for warmth. Their grief showed in tight smiles and quiet corrections. They had always been both bereaved and practiced about their grief's presentation. It was easy, the judge would say later in chambers, to empathize with someone who had lost a daughter. The moral complexity of that grief made an opponent, but it did not make their claims self-evident in law. Eleanor's voice in court carried the brittle certainty of someone who had learned to love a daughter through the language of guardianship. Lists of doctors, of schools, of index cards with names and phone numbers. "We are asking," she said slowly into the microphone, eyes on the judge, "for a temporary guardianship in the boy's best interest while matters of stability are clarified." James read the room like a man measuring risk. He offered evidence in the form of witnesses who would argue that men of wealth, however well-meaning, could be distracted, and that grief, however heavy, could become an incapacitating force. Edward sat with his hands clenched around the edge of the table as Joseph Kim whispered procedural notes at his ear. He had rehearsed being modest and human, and when called to testify, his voice was not the booming oratory of a CEO, but a simpler thing, a boyish falter and a steadying thereafter. He spoke of Rebecca with a grief that did not become an indictment. He spoke of failed attempts at parenting that had relied on schedules rather than presence. He told plainly of the nights he had not known how to stay, and the nights that followed when he learned what staying could mean, how it looked in chamomile, in sketchbooks, in a painted pebble placed on the mantel. When Maya took the stand, she did so not with dramatic affect, nor with the desire to perform truth. She spoke with the language of small facts that, strung together, formed a pattern. Her testimony was a ledger of presence, dates and times when the boys had slept 3 consecutive nights without waking, the counselor's notation of decreased outbursts, the twins' teacher recounting the day Ethan raised his hand in class to answer a question. She read from logs she had kept, bedtimes, meals, the sketches the boys had drawn that showed weather moving from storms to sunny days. She described rituals with a specificity that made them credible. Eli insisted on the same blue cup at breakfast. Ethan hummed a particular line of the lullaby when he was safe. Under cross-examination, Eleanor's lawyer asked pointedly about Maya's background, questions that brushed against the wounds she had learned not to widen. Mr. Hollingsworth pushed on training and certifications on whether lived experience could be equated with professional practice. Maya answered, sometimes with a quiet correction, "I'm not replacing a psychologist. I'm a caregiver and mentor who works with professionals." And sometimes with a simple human detail. "I've sat in hospital halls until dawn, waiting for a child to sleep." Her calmness was not invulnerability, but steadiness, and it gave the judge a portrait of someone who both maintained boundaries and offered consistent care. Belle's testimony was brief but enormous. She had been reluctant, a girl who had learned how to disappear so she would not be asked to come apart in public, yet she arrived with a folded page of drawings and read, from a thin voice that swelled with courage, about the afternoons when someone had taught her to sew the torn hem of her jacket, about the week someone sat with her while she cried and did not try to fix it. She spoke of the center, what it had been when it was a word, and what it could be when people made it with real accountability. Belle never named details she did not consent to share, but the judge did not need the specifics. He needed to know that there existed a community that could provide stability, and a woman who had watched others offer care that changed outcomes. When the judge rendered his decision, he spoke with a judicial gravity that acknowledged the pain of loss and the complicated nature of family. He cited continuity and the children's best interest. He noted Edward's demonstrable steps towards sustained presence, the counseling records and the witnesses' testimonies that mapped months of pattern rather than the sudden convenience of performance. He noted the Hollingsworths' love for Rebecca, their pain, and the legitimate questions they raised. The ruling, in the end, favored Edward's custody subject to oversight. A continued counseling plan, periodic reviews, and a court-appointed guardian ad litem to ensure that the twins' voices were represented in care decisions. It was not a vindication of any one person. It was a scaffold built in law around the small practices Maya and Edward had begun to sustain. Outside the courthouse, the press had assembled in modest numbers. Cameras clicked like small mechanical birds. Reporters from the local paper to a regional morning show circled with sympathetic pens. Edward did not give an interview that day. He and Maya left quietly, joined by Mr. Keller and Harold, walking together like a small delegation that had weathered a storm. The twins clung to Maya's hand, and for the first time in months allowed the city's noise to be something that could be background rather than threat. The victory felt like a compromise and like a relief. Edward and Maya stood beneath a grey sky with the twins between them, and Edward did something small that would become habitual. He thanked Maya in a way that was neither grand nor perfunctory. He placed his hand on her shoulder, fingers like a promise. She nodded, not with submission, but with the tired satisfaction of someone who had insisted on terms and seen them honored. Their energy turned quickly, not to celebration but to construction. The Hawthorne-Williams Center, in its first shoring act, moved from idea to space. Edward provided a donated building, an old community house by the river, and a budget. Maya insisted on hiring people who had lived the work the center would do. They created positions with titles that mattered: mentor leader, survivor liaison, program coordinator. Wages were fair. The board had seats for Joseph Kim and Dr. Angela Monroe, for Lionel Pierce, and for community members who had walked years of unstable housing and now wanted to set rules. Maya chaired a hiring committee and pushed for a governance charter that protected survivor leadership against tokenism. "We can have donors," she would say at the first board meeting, "but donors cannot have veto on who leads day to day. The people in our seats have to be those who know the work in their bones." Belle, who had grown quieter since the court, arrived at the centre clutching a backpack with a frayed strap and a sketchbook. She wandered the rooms like someone who could not be claimed. Her early days were marked by avoidance. She refused to eat in the communal dining room. She slept with a light on. She criticized the music choices with sharp dismissals. Maya did not prod so much as make space. She introduced Belle to a mentor named Carla, a woman who had been through foster care and had owned a small tailoring business. Carla taught Belle to repair clothes, first as practical work, then as metaphor. When Belle sewed the first invisible knot, she felt herself tighten and then relax in a way that had nothing to do with stitches and everything to do with skill and agency. Art became Belle's language, her sketchbook filled with faces, some angry, some small, some smiling in ways that looked like surprises. One piece in particular, a mural-sized collage of magazine cuttings and charcoal, pulled people in with a magnetism that surprised even her. It was messy and exact. Images of closed doors, hands reaching, small gold-circled scars. People said it felt like someone had taken a private pain and hung it in public with honor. Belle was asked to describe it at an internal meeting and unexpectedly did. She said, "I wanted the scar to be visible, so it wouldn't be something I had to pretend didn't exist." The language of Kinugi, the idea of repair made into art, became a term people used at intake, to celebrate repair rather than hide damage. Belle's piece became a prototype for the Hall of Resilience, a gallery they planned to open where art and stories could be displayed with consent, context, and reverence. The centre's early days were full of practical chaos. Schedules, grant applications, furniture deliveries. Edward's money solved problems that required finance. The facility's roof was fixed. The heating remained steady. A van was leased for outreach. But every day, Maya insisted on a practice that had nothing to do with capital, a daily circle where staff and participants would share, in a few sentences, what they needed and what they could offer. It made for slow, sometimes awkward meetings, people relearning how to speak from the community rather than from the institutional posture of helped. It also created accountability. If someone promised to pick up a kid from school, they did. If someone committed to leading art therapy, there was a schedule. What the center built quickly was not simply programming, but emergent culture, repair as ritual, not performance. Then the smear arrived like a winter gust. It started with an anonymous tip to a city reporter, a scanned form purporting to be an intake assessment from years previous for Belle, alleging neglect in some institution and implying that Maya or someone at the center had misrepresented Belle's history. The form, read aloud, suggested that Belle had been placed into the wrong program at an earlier age and that signatures had been forged. The reporter, cautious and curious, called. The paper printed a cautious piece with questions and quotes from anonymous sources that smelled faintly of conspiracy. Social media ate it. Clicks laced the story like a contagion. Board members received inquiries. Donors paused responses. Volunteers asked for clarification. The center, secure in its values but fragile in reputation, braced. Maya felt the old hollow of exposure in her chest. She had navigated false narratives before, of people who assumed a woman's scars were signifiers of incapacity rather than evidence of survival. But this attack was different because it tried to manufacture documentary evidence. It was an attempt to translate suspicion into ledger entries. Edward mobilized resources, lawyers, digital forensics, and an independent audit of intake forms. Joseph Kim pulled in favors. Lionel Pierce crafted a media response emphasizing transparency and inviting investigation. Dr. Angela Monroe coordinated with counselors to prepare affidavits that would protect client privacy while attesting to the center's practices. The team decided on two principles: never air a minor's pain for headlines and be scrupulously documented in responding. Belle, however, was the center of the smear in a way that frightened everyone most. The forged intake attached a name and a history to her private records. The forger had attempted to suggest that Belle's case had been mishandled earlier and that the center had either been negligent or complicit. The evidence on its face was flimsy, old fonts misaligned, a mismatched signature, but plausible enough to make a dent in public confidence. The forger had counted on that plausibility. For days, the center's leadership debated strategy. Some urged silence to avoid amplifying falsehoods. Others demanded a public rebuke. There was a practical risk. If the paper ran an expository piece that suggested the center's intake procedures were lax, grant-makers might delay funding, regulatory bodies might initiate reviews. Edward, who had been learning restraint, asked the hardest question of all: how to protect Belle without making her a spectacle. He argued for a private path to expose the forgery, while preparing a public moment of collective testimony that placed Belle at the center, only if she chose to be. Belle chose slowly. She had been silent for a week, bouncing to the edges of rooms. One evening, Maya found her at a small desk in the art room, under a lamp, press-release drafts stacked like paper walls. Belle was bending over a small pebble, painting gold into a crack. She did not look up when Maya entered. Her fingers worked with intent. When Maya sat, Belle said simply, "I can speak, but only if I say what I want, not what they want." Maya understood and did not push. She sat beside Belle and told her the practical parts of what they were doing: forensics on the document, a motion to subpoena metadata, an audit of intake protocols, the outreach to victims' advocates to shore community support. They found the first break in the forgery by tracing the metadata of the scanned PDF that had circulated. A digital sleuth discovered that the file had been created in a local print shop and uploaded at a time that did not match the timeline the document purported. A handwriting analyst, working pro bono, compared signatures and found irregularities. A counselor's office provided original intake forms from their archives that proved protocols had been followed. Slowly, the forgery unraveled, not because of bravado, but because of methodical, unflashy work. The exposé became public in a counter-article written by a reporter who had been skeptical from the start and who now published the forensics and the audit. The piece documented the source of the leak: an individual unaffiliated with the center, someone who had grudges from a prior dispute and who had hoped to sow distrust. The local paper retracted the thin insinuation and issued a correction. Social media commentary shifted as people read the documentation and found the smear's hand trembled under scrutiny. Donors who had paused resumed communication. Volunteers returned. Yet the victory felt expensive. Belle had been forced to consider herself as evidence in a public fight she did not ask to wage. The center had endured the proximity of trauma and the leverage of reputation. Their resilience had its costs, the emotional toll, the bruise of being doubted. That was why, when the press conference was planned, it was not Edward who took the podium, nor the board member who polished a soundbite. It was Belle. She arrived with a cardigan, with her sketchbook under her arm. There were chairs behind her filled with community members who had consented to be visible. Teachers, counselors, Mr. Keller, a neighbor with a stroller, people who had watched the center map small changes into real lives. Belle's microphone shook at the start. She read a short statement about truth and agency. Then she did something unexpected. She opened her sketchbook and showed one image after another. Pages that documented repair in small increments. A hem, a sun, hands holding a cup. She spoke plainly about being afraid that her life would be turned into a question for clicks. She said, "I decide how my story is told." Then she did one more thing. She invited anyone who had been helped by the center to speak, to stand, to name what continuity had meant for them. People stood. A woman from the neighborhood, a man who had been in the men's program, a mother of two, a teacher, all told brief truths. Their voices were not rehearsed. They were the tonalities of lives that had been steadied. The press listened. The narrative shifted from suspicion to a story of a community defending its own. The demonstrative power of those voices was the kind of proof that audits could not manufacture, moral witness. In the weeks that followed, the center did more than survive. It built safeguards, clearer intake procedures, consent-driven storytelling policies, an independent advisory council that included legal advocates. They documented practices, not as a veneer for donors, but as a protection of dignity. Edward funded training and insisted on transparent reporting to the community board. Maya insisted on mentoring salaries that recognized the emotional labor of survivors. The work had started as a household's attempt to keep two boys sleeping, and it had become, with many halting steps and arguments, an institution that held certain values, lived leadership, transparent money, and a practice-oriented humility. Belle's work with art expanded into the Hall of Resilience. The opening was modest, an evening where people came with tea and sandwiches, where the room smelled like varnish and old paper, and yet it was the kind of modesty that held weight. They installed the mural Belle had made. They placed small placards that explained the kinugi metaphor, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold to emphasize rather than hide the cracks. The hall displayed not the raw trauma of its participants, but artifacts of repair, a coat with a carefully stitched elbow, a child's drawing with a gold-painted seam, recorded oral narratives told on terms of consent. At the center of the hall, a shelf held a collection of painted rocks, some with a gleam of gold at their edges, others with small handwritten affirmations. Visitors were encouraged to add their own. One child painted a tiny star and left it next to a pebble labeled Hold. Maya and Edward walked the hall together one night after the opening. The crowd had gone. Only the faint echo of conversations lingered. They paused at Belle's mural. "You did that," Edward said, voice low and a little raw with something like awe. "You made something out of what was." Maya looked at him and could see in the way his mouth moved an unfamiliar humility. "We all did," she said. "People who stayed. People who kept showing up in small ways." Their personal lives continued to realign. Lorraine Williams arrived in the city with a slow, complicated apology. Her approach was not cinematic. She came with a small duffel and a bus ticket. For a long time, Maya had watched the door for people who left children behind, had learned to be suspicious of apologies. Lorraine did not arrive with theatrics. She sat across from Maya at the kitchen table and handed over a small, wrinkled envelope, a letter from the past, in which Lorraine tried to explain her absence, not as an undoing, but as a symptom of her own survival. Lorraine had been working a distance job in another state and had only recently stabilized her life. She spoke with the frankness of someone who had been in rehab and in therapy and who had come to grips with the ways she had been absent. Their reunion was not a movie's sweeping embrace. It was a series of careful conversations. Lorraine met Belle, who was polite but guarded. She met the twins and offered a soft, deliberate apology. Maya allowed herself to test the waters. She and Lorraine attended therapy together for a number of sessions, reluctantly at first and then slowly, searching. Lorraine's presence did not erase any of the past. It created an additional layer to tend to, a new seam to mend, with the same principle: repair visible, not erased. There was another family story to be managed. Maya's father, a man who had been in and out of her life, re-emerged with hesitant attempts at reconciliation. He arrived sober, or at least in a period of reported sobriety, and asked to be useful in small, practical ways, fixing a fence, hauling boxes to the center. Maya, who had learned to value both boundaries and mercy, allowed him to help but kept him close. She refused to be swallowed by the fantasy of sudden father-daughter restoration. It was messy in an ordinary way, small betrayals, apologies, a late-night call that went unanswered. But she let a relationship be tested in minutes rather than reimagined as a miracle. Edward, for his part, formalized the arrangements that had been informal. He drew up a co-director agreement that named Maya as co-director with equal decision-making authority on programmatic issues. He set legal protections so that if anything were to happen to him again, the boy's guardian ad litem would consider Maya's role and the community's continuity in any plan. The lawyer drafted a guardianship contingency that ensured culture and care would be preserved. It was not a romantic gesture so much as an expression of institutional humility, legal scaffolding that honored lived relationships. One late afternoon, months after the Hall of Resilience opened, Edward asked Maya to walk with him to the community garden. The sun lay long on the benches, and the oak tree they had planted months earlier had a new set of leaves that fluttered like pages. They had not planned fanfare. Instead, Edward carried a small tin with seeds and a wrapped pebble, the painted gold-edged stone they had used as a quiet ritual in their home. He knelt with an awkward precision and suggested they plant something new, a sapling for the garden of the center, a living marker of what they had learned. He did not produce a ring. He did not utter a rehearsed speech. He offered language that was both private and pragmatic. He said, "I want to promise to keep building this with you, not as a contract, but as a practice. Will you keep doing this with me? Building, staying, leading?" Maya, who had not been given much in her life that lasted without conditions, looked at him and then at the boys nearby, who were digging a small trench with squeals of laughter. She felt the weight of all their years and the delicacy of a moment that asked for faith more than theatrical commitment. She clasped his hand, and with a voice that might as well have been a vow, she said yes. The promise was small and entirely true. A partnership shaped by shared work and mutual respect, not a rescue narrative dressed in gold. Edward drafted an internal document that named Maya as co-guardian in the event of his incapacity. They signed it privately and later filed the legal paperwork that made their informal practices legible to the systems that keep children safe. The center, over the next seasons, expanded deliberately. They opened mentorship academies, trained staff with trauma-informed care, built partnerships with schools for early intervention programs, and launched a small social enterprise that taught vocational skills, sewing, carpentry, gardening to youth. They maintained an ethos of lived leadership by reserving leadership seats for those who had been through the system, and by funding research that measured outcomes in terms of stability, not sensational statistics. There were setbacks. A staff member left suddenly after an old grievance surfaced. A grant that had seemed promising shrank in size after budget constraints. A fire alarm that went off during a late-night workshop left the room in screams and checking the list of children present. None of these derailed them. They met each one as they had learned to meet the smear, methodically, with humility and with accountability. They expanded cautiously, refusing to scale before the work had been baked into the center's culture. On the day they inaugurated the Kinugi Gallery inside the Hall of Resilience, the twins, no longer small shadows of sleep deprivation, led a small procession. Each participant placed a painted rock on a ledge that ran like a river through the gallery. People who had been helped by the center wrote short notes on cardstock about what their scars had taught them. Maya and Edward placed their stones together. Belle added a small star she had painted in acrylics. Lorraine, who had been reconciled enough to stand at a distance, brought a single wildflower and pressed it between two stones. The hall smelled of varnish and jasmine tea. Volunteers handed out small cards that explained Kinugi. Visitors moved in slow circles, reading remarks that ranged from practical, "I learned to ask for homework help," to sublime, My scar is a road to someone else. The exhibition refused to fetishize trauma, it honored repair. People left with a small gold-edged pebble as a token, a reminder that repair could be visible and that scars could teach. Years passed in the accruing way of days. The Hawthorne Williams Center opened a satellite in a small town an hour away. They trained staff who had no direct personal connection to the initial family, yet who understood their models. They developed a training curriculum that blended clinical insight with lived narrative, and they shared it with other non-profits. The twins grew into adolescent boys who painted murals with Belle at the wall sometimes and argued about music at breakfast sometimes. Ethan took to carpentry, where he liked the blunt finality of making something that didn't move when you thought it should. Eli became interested in plant biology, and he spent afternoons in the garden measuring leaf veins and counting beetles. Maya's role shifted in subtle ways. She was still present in the household, but spent more time at the center, mentoring other staff and sitting on training panels. She refused fame, but accepted the occasional invitation to talk about survivor-led leadership. She always spoke in the same terms, a call for codes of practice that protected dignity, a plea to funders to trust survivors, and an insistence that presence was the primary metric of care. Edward, who still carried the stub of grief like a private stone, learned to be less performative about apology and more exact in the mathematics of rest. He took fewer business trips. He sat through school concerts without stepping out to take a call. He had a small ritual with the boys. Every Sunday night he would read a page from a book he himself had loved as a child. Those pages became an uneven chain that linked him to a lineage of presence that had nothing to do with capital. Their life together was not a story of seamless happiness. There were nights when old habits tugged at Edward, when pride pushed him into a command he needed to apologize for later. There were moments when Belle and other youth would be entangled in complicated family dynamics, and the center would need to engage in casework that proved messy and draining. Maya sometimes found herself sleepless, attending a text at 3 a.m. about a youth in crisis. These were not tragedies that undermined the whole. They were the steady hum of a life that demanded repair beyond going. At the center, they launched a Hall of Resilience program for parents that taught boundary setting, legal literacy, and practical skills for navigating systems. They partnered with local schools to create early intervention referrals. They started a small fellowship that paid stipends to survivors to train new staff. Each of these programs had a slow, iterative pace. Success was measured in the number of nights children slept uninterrupted, in the months a mentor could remain employed, in the art pieces that refused to be reductive. The final scene of the center's first decade was a modest ceremony beneath the oak tree in the community garden. The twins, taller now, shoulders broader with adolescence, helped plant a sapling that would one day outgrow them. Belle stood with a sketchbook that had become thicker with years. Lorraine and Maya, near each other but not fused, watched as Edward, hands not as steady as they used to be but steadier in the right ways, tucked soil around the young trunk. They invited the community to add painted stones to a ring around the tree. The ring gleamed with gold-edged scars of paint and words: stay, hold, repair, witness. They said small things, thank yous, acknowledgments of loss, and nothing about resurrections. There were no grand proclamations. The promise that had been made beneath the oak years before was still kept in small ways. A legal file in a cabinet, a scholarship for youth, a roster of mentors who had come through the system themselves. The town, circa that day, had the steady hum of children playing in the distance, the clatter of cups from the center's kitchen, and a sense that the world could be, if not fixed, then rearranged, so that harm found some resistance. Maya gathered the painted pebbles she had kept from the first months, a small, gold-edged stone that had been a private ritual, and placed it next to the sapling. She had carried it through courtrooms, through smear attempts, through board meetings. It had warmed in her pocket and cooled in her palm, and now it rested in the newly turned soil like a small, deliberate inclusion. Edward dug his fingers into the dirt and then raised his hand to steady hers. They did not need to say everything aloud. When dusk came, they lit lanterns along the path. The lights made the gold in the stones flash like a small constellation. Children chased one another in the distance and stopped to look at the mural in the Hall of Resilience. Belle sat on a bench and sketched the scene. People, light, small rocks. The twins, leaning against one another, hummed a line of the lullaby Maya had taught them. It was not a hymn of repair completed, but an acknowledgement that the work of mending was ongoing and communal. As the night settled in, Maya walked to the oak and placed her hand on the rough bark. The tree, still young by a tree's measure, was steady. She thought of the morning she had left in the rain to protect small sleeping heads, of the choice to return under her own terms, of agreements signed in living rooms and legal offices, and of the community that had learned to speak in steady, cautious witness. She did not allow herself triumph. Instead, she catalogued gratitude in the quiet way she had always done, naming small things, clutching them like a ledger. Edward joined her. They stood with their shoulders touching, then turned to watch the kids and the mural and the ring of gold-edged stones. Belle came by with a thermos and handed one to Maya, a small kindness that was also, in its way, an acceptance. Lorraine and Maya exchanged a look that had seen therapy rooms and awkward meals and slow apologies. It was not a full reconciliation in the cinematic sense, but it was repair accepted and ongoing. The last light of the evening caught a line of small stones under the oak, each painted with a word or a mark: hold, heal, stay, stitch. Someone had written a child's scrawl: hope. Maya picked up one of the rocks, no bigger than a fist, its edge painted with a fine line of gold. She thought of the Kinugi philosophy, to mend in a way that shows the seam. She placed the rock back into the ring and felt the warm weight of its truth. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances.